Commentary on Matthew chapter 9. Here we have an account of many of the mighty miracles of Jesus. He went about curing all manner of diseases, as it says. He raised the dead, brought a dead girl back to life, and these are mighty miracles indeed. About 21 years ago, I was a missionary in Argentina, and I knocked on this door of a doctor, this surgeon. He came out and saw that I represented the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He said, "Ah, yes, Jesus Christ." The one thing I could never get past about the story of Jesus was this. I have been a doctor for so many years, for several decades, and I have never once seen a dead person on the operating table come back to life. In spite of all the great advances of modern medicine, I have never once seen that, so I cannot believe the story of Jesus, he said. And I replied something along the lines of, well, that is why these are called miracles. And he said, well, I don't believe in miracles. But it is one thing to look at these miraculous feats of seemingly supernatural power and marvel or wonder or doubt. But there is a greater miracle here in Matthew chapter 9 than all of them. A greater miracle than raising the dead. Yes, by far. And we find that at the beginning, where the man who was sick of the palsy was brought to Christ, this man unable to walk, unable to stand. And you'll notice the first thing Jesus said to him was not, "Stand up, arise, be healed." No. Instead, he said something much more important and much more controversial. "Thy sins be forgiven thee." The miracle of forgiveness, my friends, is the greatest miracle wrought by Jesus Christ, by far. It may not be the flashiest, most attention-getting one. How many, forgiven of their sins, like those blind people who were healed, would run about telling everybody, hey, Jesus forgave me of my sins. It's a miracle. I've met a few people who act like that, but the majority of us, now we save that behavior for the ostentatious miracles, if you will. But I'm going to tell you something. The healing of the sick is a symbol here for the greater miracle. And Christ shows that to us when he forgave this man of his sins. And certain of the scribes contended in their hearts, what is he talking about? This is blasphemy. Only God can forgive the sins. Who does this guy think he is? And Jesus, being the Son of God, has that capacity to discern their hearts. And says, "Wherefore think ye evil in your hearts," in verse 4. Verse 5, "For whether it is easier to say, thy sins be forgiven thee, or to say, arise and walk." And now, in verse 6, the purpose of this object lesson of causing the lame to walk, "But that ye may know that the Son of Man hath power on earth to forgive sins. Then saith he to the sick of the palsy, Arise, take up thy bed, and go unto thy house." And so it was. The physical healing was a symbol of the greater miracle of forgiveness, the spiritual healing. Christ saves us from what? We always talk about Jesus saves. Jesus is our Savior. What does Jesus save us from? Two things. Physical death, because of his own death on the cross and his resurrection in the garden tomb on that third day. Because of that resurrection, because he overcame death, Jesus saves us from physical death, a free gift to all. that at the last days all mankind shall be resurrected, the body and the spirit reunited, immortal, unable to die, unable to be sick, afflicted, etc., in a perfect state, physically perfect state, but then brought before the judgment bar of Christ to be judged according to what they did in the flesh in this life. Which brings us to the second thing. Christ saves us from spiritual death. Now, the resurrection it's a real thing, but it is also a symbol. That physical healing, it is a symbol of the spiritual healing from the second death, the spiritual death, which is sin. What is sin? So many arguments about this within the sects of Christianity. I will put it as simply as I can. Sin is knowing the will of God and acting contrary to it. And that's it. Acting contrary to the will of God. In the Old Testament, there are 613, I believe, 613 commandments, both spiritual and secular, that were given to the ancient Israelites. And those secular commandments, everything was spelled out for them. How many steps they were able to take on the Sabbath day before it was considered not keeping the Sabbath day holy according to the commandment. What they were to eat or not eat, and so on. All of these little nitty-gritty things. 613 commandments. A ridiculous number of individual things to remember. And there was a man came to Christ and said, "Good master." Christ rebuked him, saying, "Why callest thou me good? There is only one good, and that is God alone." But his question was, what is the greatest commandment? And Christ, instead of spelling out, well, we have the 613, Jewish commandments. No, he said, the greatest commandment of all is to love God above all else, and the second is like unto it, to love your neighbor as yourself. So compiling those commandments into two. But I'm going to tell you something. How many ways are there to love God above all else? Well, there's one, and then there's everything. Everything we can possibly do or think or say fits into that equation, showing whether or not we really do love God above all else. How many ways are there to love our neighbors as ourselves, or to fail to do so? So it's not just about what we do, it's about what we don't do, what we fail to do. So there, if we were to count the number of ways, if we were to put a number of actual ways to sin, it would be far, far greater than 613. It would be innumerable. There is an innumerable number of ways to sin, to fall short of the glory of God, to die spiritually. There is an innumerable number of ways to separate ourselves from the presence of God through sin, by not abiding by His will, by knowing His will and not doing it. And because of that, all of us are sinners, simply put. And that's something we just can't get past on our own as much as we try. So there's a bunch of stuff we can do for ourselves in this life, right? We can wipe our own butts or whatever, but those two things we cannot and will never be able to do for ourselves. Just like that surgeon said to me, I have never been able to bring somebody back to life. That's right. Only God has that power. And the other thing, we cannot save ourselves from sin. We can try as we might. We can try to do all the good deeds in the world. We can try to make it up. And we should. But only Christ has the power to forgive our sins. So that at that last day, when resurrected selves are brought before the judgment bar of Christ, that we will not shrink before his presence. We often tend to think this picture in our mind of we show up there and Jesus wags his fingers like, get out of here, gives us the boot. I don't believe that's how it's going to go. If we are not worthy to stand in the presence of God because we knew his will, we knew what he wanted us to do, and we didn't do it, we're going to feel that. It's not going to be him giving us the boot. It's going to be us shrinking from before the presence of the Lord. Knowing what we should have done, but chose not to. So, Christ goes about in Matthew chapter 9, healing, and it's quite interesting. It reminds me of those older role-playing games like Elder Scrolls 3, Morrowind, where you're given this main quest, and then you get sidetracked with all these side quests along the way. It's loads of fun, but here Jesus, he's going to a specific destination to go heal somebody, and on the way, the woman comes, gives him this side quest, if you will, grabs his clothes, thinking, if I just can touch him, I will be whole. And Jesus proclaims to her, and also to the blind people, that it's because of their faith that they are healed. Not because of some magic power emanating from Jesus, but because they believed. They believed in his divinity, that he was the Son of God. They believed that he was able to do it. And because of one way of looking at this narrative, it's easy for people to think, okay, faith means if you believe hard enough, magic tricks happen. And I don't believe that's the case. Christ has the power to do all things. If he spoke the word, it would happen. As far-fetched as that word might seem, it would happen if he spoke the word. But faith can move mountains. But we have to participate. Faith is an action word. It's not simply blind belief. Faith is doing something. So that woman actively sought out Christ. She fought her way through the crowd. She reached out. She reached out believing, if I can touch the hem of his garment, if I can touch the clothes he's wearing, that will be enough. She held on to that belief, and it was so. Jesus allowed it to be so. The blind men came to Christ, and he asked them before he healed them. When they asked, have mercy on us. And he said, believe ye that I am able to do this? Now this is coming from Jesus, who had previously demonstrated he could understand people's thoughts. Essentially, he could hear people's thoughts. He knew what they were thinking and what they were feeling. He knew where these blind men, where their faith was. But he asked them, why is that important? That they vocalize in their own words, yea, Lord, yes, Jesus, we believe you can do this. Why is it so important that we participate in the act of faith? Think about that. That faith is not simply something that is done to us, it is something we participate in. That we actually have to believe it. So he went about, he cast out devils, he told the blind men, don't tell anybody about this. Keep it on the down low, and of course, they didn't. I mean, it's hard to blame them. After all, they spent whatever portion of their lives blind, and suddenly they could see. The word is going to get out. Of course, Christ knows this. But he demonstrates a certain humility there. Essentially saying, look, I am not seeking fame. I am seeking the glory of God alone through these actions. And at the end of the chapter, a great multitude gathers round. They begin to follow Christ, and he says to his disciples, "The harvest truly is plenteous, but the laborers are few. Pray ye therefore the Lord of the harvest, that he will send forth laborers into his harvest." So, in the next chapter, we have the narrative of Christ giving the apostolic calling to his 12 apostles, which is different, importantly different than disciples. We'll get into that next time. Sending them forth to declare the gospel, to be the laborers in the harvest of bringing souls unto Christ, of spreading that message of what Christ saves us from physical death and from spiritual death, if it so be that we participate with our faith and believe